forgotten about it. See?
That seems to be working. Check, check. Love that. All right, folks, we're going to go ahead and get started. First off, just congratulations to everybody who has made it to the last session of a 2-day conference. I don't know about you, but certainly being around so many people at once, this is the most people I've been around in about 2.5 years. So that definitely comes with an energy price tag, right? A personal energy price tag. So my hat is off to all of us who have made it. Congratulations. I'm Shyle Ruder. I use she, her, hers pronouns. I'm the Education Outreach Director at the Fair Housing Council of Oregon. We are a statewide private civil rights organization, and we work to end illegal housing discrimination through access to education about fair housing. We proactively promote housing justice, equity, and inclusion. And when our education efforts do not work, we also have an enforcement team. And so people can contact us if they feel like they have experienced housing discrimination. So in addition to being the Education Outreach Director at the Fair Housing Council of Oregon, prior to that, I've spent about 19 years working in HIV/AIDS services, with the majority of that being focused on housing as well. So working with people living with HIV, many are living outdoors, are houseless, 200% of the federal poverty level or below, also with co-occurring disorders. In addition to that, I am also a homeowner. I bought a house as a single woman when I was 25 here in Portland before everything started to really blow up and things got unaffordable. In addition to that, I've also been somebody who rented out that house, so I've been on the other side of that as well. Additionally, I am also the daughter of a single mother. I'm a daughter of a single mother who left my father in 1977, when women were not divorcing men in Kearney, Nebraska. Our housing opportunities were significantly limited because my mother was a single parent of 2 young children. And because she was a woman who had been a wife, she was not allowed to have credit in her name. It was in the man's name. And so our housing opportunities were extremely limited for many years until she could build up her own credit and actually afford to buy a house on her own. So the idea of housing opportunity, meaning home ownership opportunity, is very, very near and dear to my heart personally. Doing this kind of work has been really interesting because it has given me the opportunity also to talk to my mother very specifically about her experiences when I was a child. And oftentimes parents are trying to protect us from what they experience. And so then to have her be able to talk to me as an adult very frankly about what that was like and how much fear goes along with that as well, based on, where we had to live, because it's where we could afford to live or where we could qualify. It's been a really important experience. Prior to us jumping in all the way to this presentation, I do have to make a disclaimer. The work that provided the basis for this publication was supported by funding under a grant with the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD. The substance and findings of this work are dedicated to the public. The author and publisher are solely responsible for the accuracy of the statements and interpretations contained in this publication. Such interpretations do not necessarily reflect the views of the federal government. So we have been doing a lot of work over the last year specific to housing discrimination in the home buying process, and that's been funded through a grant with HUD. Within that process, one of my favorite parts of really trying to do an assessment of what housing discrimination in home buying looks like in the state of Oregon has been that we were able to do focus groups. And we did 4 different focus groups. One focus group was with English-speaking prospective home buyers to talk to us about what housing discrimination looked like in purchasing homes. One group was with prospective home buyers that were Spanish speakers. One group was with social service organizations that had home buyer programs. And then also one was with realtors. And with that focus group, we had a lot of realtors of color actually show up to that focus group and then share their experiences with us of what it's like to be a realtor of color, but also how their identity then impacts the ability of their client to purchase a home as well. So a lot of the information that's being put into this presentation today is very much informed by what we learned out of those focus groups. So, as I said, we are a statewide civil rights organization. When I started at the organization, we were 10 people. That was 6 years ago. We have expanded now to be over 20 people. Our education outreach team was 9 people or 3 people, and now it's 9 people. So we have staff in Southern Oregon, Eastern Oregon, Central Oregon, the coastal region, the Portland metro area, the greater Willamette Valley area. So we really do have statewide coverage, which is really important when we're talking about housing discrimination, because what we know is that housing discrimination in urban areas can look very different than what housing discrimination looks like in rural areas. Also, we work to proactively promote housing justice, equity, and inclusion. And how we do that is through education and enforcement of fair housing law. So I'm going to do a basic overview of what fair housing law is, and then I'm going to go into historical patterns here in Oregon that are about housing displacement, discrimination, segregation, because they still have their effects today. And then we're going to talk about discrimination techniques that we still hear about today that are happening. So these laws, fair housing laws, they are civil rights laws that promote equal access to housing. So oftentimes when we think about civil rights, we think, I shouldn't be treated differently in an employment situation because of the color of my skin or because of my religion, because of my gender. This is that same set of laws, but they're applied specifically to housing. It makes it illegal for housing providers to discriminate against certain groups of people. And we call these certain groups of people protected classes. How I like to think about that is protected identities. And we all belong to protected classes. So what is fair housing? It's the right of all people to be free from illegal discrimination in the rental, sale, or financing of housing. So housing discrimination then means treating a person differently in any type of a housing transaction because that person is a member of a protected class, or another way to think of that is because of that person's protected identity. So them getting treated differently because of their protected identity. So the federally protected classes. So anywhere we go in this country, these classes, these identities are protected. Race, color, national origin, and religion. These were the first 4 protected classes that were added in 1968 when the Fair Housing Act passed. Then in 1974, as part of the women's movement, we see sex being added as a protected class as well. That includes survivors of domestic violence, because the majority of people who are survivors of domestic violence identify as women or femme. So this does become a fair housing issue because the issues that come along, the barriers getting into housing, people getting kicked out of housing related to situations of domestic violence disproportionately affect women and femme identifying individuals. So there are fair housing protections there. Also, under this current presidential administration, we see sexual orientation and gender identity also added as a protected identity. However, in the state of Oregon, it doesn't change much because we have seen that protection in place for quite some time here. Familial status, meaning families with children, that was added as a protected class in 1988. Prior to 1988, nearly 70% of landlords in the rental market in Oregon would not rent to families with children. So imagine how hard it would be to find safe, stable, affordable housing to rent if 70% of the housing market is unavailable just because of a protected identity. We can pull up statistics like that for any one of these groups, which is frankly why we have these protected classes in the first place. Disability was also added in 1988 as part of the independent living movement. People were moving outside of institutional settings, moving into the community and finding that they did not have equal access to housing choice or opportunity. Now, I've realized that I started to get going too fast and forgot to say, Gina, will you pass out some of our materials? So I've got some materials today, copies of the PowerPoint if you would like them. Also, just some of our general fair housing brochures, and also a one-pager about fair housing law specific to the home buying process. So please feel free to take some of those. If you want some extras for your colleagues, feel free to do that as well. Okay. So Oregon goes on to add additional protected classes. Marital status is protected. So somebody buying a home shouldn't be related to if they're married, single, widowed, or divorced. So let's say that there's a realtor that says to a buying agent, well, tell me about your buyers. And what's disclosed is, oh, the buyers are a lesbian couple. And then, right? And then the selling agent gives that information then to the home seller and they say, oh, well, they're not married and they're lesbian. We don't want to rent to them. That could be a big, big flag of housing discrimination. So marital status, sexual orientation, gender identity should not come into play. Also, source of income is protected. So this means if somebody has a housing subsidy, like a Section 8 voucher, a housing choice voucher, that shouldn't come into play. They shouldn't be denied a rental because of that. We normally see discrimination around source of income more in the rental market, but where we might see this coming into the home buyer market is if somebody gets their benefits from TANF or SSI or SSDI, and somehow that information gets used to turn them down as possibly buying a property. Whereas TANF, SSI, SSDI are not expressly listed within this protected class, if you actually read through the legislative intent that was included, it mentions TANF, SSI, SSDI. So why I bring this up is there are cases where a complainant feels like they've been discriminated against based on that source of income, and those cases have settled in favor of the complainant. So when we're teaching these sessions to housing providers, we always say, just assume that is source of income. Again, sexual orientation, gender identity is protected here in the state of Oregon. And then also there are local jurisdictions that add additional protected classes. So for example, Multnomah County, Beaverton adds occupation, so type of occupation, and also age over 18 as protected class. We see that age over 18 protection added in a lot of the different college towns where people are more likely to get discriminated against because of their age range. You know, landlords saying things like, I don't want to rent to anybody who's under the age of 24, because the assumption is, you know, if they're under that age, they're going to destroy things, they're going to ... That's the problem, is that in the housing process, assumptions about a person and who they are and how they are based on their identity leads to housing discrimination. So the whole purpose of these laws, these fair housing laws, is to promote equal access to housing choice, regardless of identity, because assumptions about a person should never play into their ability to access housing for themselves. So who has to follow these laws? The short answer is anybody that touches the housing process. So we're looking at sellers and buyers, property managers, maintenance staff. Maintenance staff also includes, let's say that a contractor is coming in to do work, that contractor also has to follow fair housing law. So it can't be like that contractor is, you know, harassing somebody because of their protected identity. That would be problematic under fair housing. Homeowners associations, we're going to talk about homeowners associations, why they were created, the problems they create around disparity in home ownership. Real estate agents, mortgage lenders, financial institutions, insurance companies, neighbors, jurisdictions, and advertising media. So Facebook has been smacked several times with lawsuits because they have this algorithm where if people are selling homes or advertising rentals, in that algorithm, people have been able to specify who they want to see these ads. And how they specify that has historically been linked to people's protected identities. So controlling where advertisements and who those advertisements actually get to based on protected identity is problematic under fair housing. So they have had to adjust their algorithm to comply with fair housing. Fair housing laws apply to dwellings. So this is houses, apartments, regardless of the number of units, condos, floating homes, mobile homes, and these are mobile homes that are actually in mobile home parks hooked up to services. So unfortunately, it's not our folks that are living in RVs or mobile homes that are moving them around every day or two. It's not if somebody is just staying in an RV park for a vacation. We're actually talking about somebody living in an RV park, right? There's no other place that they call home. Retirement housing, assisted living, nonprofit housing and shelters, and also at times motel rooms, hotel rooms, vacation rentals. So usually when we see this, you know, oftentimes when we see this is people get displaced from their home due to natural disaster like wildfires, and then they are forced to live in hotels or vacation rentals because they have no other place that they're calling home. That then qualifies under the Fair Housing Act as a dwelling. And so public accommodation law no longer applies. For housing law applies. And a lot of these housing providers don't actually realize that that shift happens when somebody is living there. So what we're going to talk now about is Oregon's historic legacy. And some of you may know a lot about this, and for some of you, it might be new information, but it's important for us to understand history if we want to understand disparities in homeownership that we see today. So Oregon's history of institutional displacement, exclusion, and segregation date back to its time even before it was a territory. So before Oregon was occupied by settlers or had even been given the name Oregon, it had been home to dozens of indigenous tribes and bands for over a millennium. However, Oregon's early political and economic systems were established with the intention of creating, in quotes, an agricultural paradise in the West. where white farmers could settle without the competition of Southern plantations. Robert Wilson Morrison, who was a white settler that arrived in the territory in 1844, is recorded declaring, in quotes, "I'm going to Oregon where there'll be no slaves and we'll all start even," end quote. His statement is reflective of a common white supremacist and anti-Black ideology shared by early Oregonians who believed the presence of any Black people, enslaved or free, would force the establishment of class distinctions and undercut the equal opportunities of white laborers. So white laborers feared unfair work competition. In 1859, Oregon became a state and was admitted into the Union, and they passed a Black exclusion law, becoming the first and only state in the US to legally exclude Black people from being residents and from owning property. This Black exclusion law was repealed in 1927, which is not that long ago. The language was not actually removed from our Constitution until 2002, 20 years ago. The 1850 Donation Land Claim Act created incentive for white settlers to occupy Oregon. So this was the creation of the Oregon Trail. And I grew up in Kearney, Nebraska, which is literally right along the Oregon Trail. The house I lived in when I was a kid was just less than a mile from where the trail ran. It was right next to Fort Kearney State Park. So we had a lot of pride in this history. We learned a lot about it, but one of the things we never talked about as kids was that the Oregon Trail was for white settlers only. Literally for white settlers only. People of color were not allowed to go on that trail. And that was further established because the only people that were given a land grant at the end of that Oregon Trail could be white. If somebody was half indigenous, half white, they could get a significantly reduced parcel of land. So a 320-acre land grant was given to each white male who had resided in the territory prior to December 1st of 1850. And he would be given double if he was married. Between 1850 and 1855, white men could receive a 160-acre land grant, double that if married. So I want you to think about, if we're talking terms of real estate, how much that land would be worth today. Because we know one of the most significant tools to accumulate generational wealth over time is access to home ownership and access to owning land. So what we're literally seeing at the time that Oregon is established as a territory, we are seeing the institutionalization of segregation, displacement, discrimination. We're seeing that from the very beginning. So within 5 years, so between 1850 and 1855, the settler population had boomed from 13,000 to 52,000. The spread of settlement and colonial violence, which resulted from this population boom, forced indigenous peoples from their homes and land due to ongoing violence, displacement, and disease. There were also sundown laws in Oregon until the 1960s and 70s. These were towns that did not allow non-white people to stay overnight or settle. There were bans on land and home ownership for Japanese and Chinese people. In 1859, the Oregon Constitution prohibited Chinese individuals from owning real estate, a law that would not be repealed until nearly 100 years later in 1943, when China was the United States ally in World War II. In 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed, which banned Chinese immigrants from entering the US. And in 1923, the Alien Land Law blocked Japanese citizens from owning land. So that's when we see many Japanese starting to buy homes in the name of their American-born children and also in the names of friends or neighbors. There was also the forced internment, concentration, and work camps during World War II for the Japanese. The Japanese and Japanese Americans, 120,000 people lost their homes. To be clear, 2/3 of those were United States citizens. In Oregon, there's been a significant history of ongoing hate and harassment, which has been used to displace individuals. Lash laws followed the Black exclusion law, which meant that Black people who stayed in Oregon after the Black exclusion law would be subject to a lashing, which merges terror and public policy. Severe anti-Chinese sentiment also was present at that time. There was so many Chinese that lived in this state were leaving areas where they had lived in Southern Oregon and Eastern Oregon because of mining jobs. They were experiencing ongoing acts of hate and harassment. So they were coming to Portland to live in a larger community where it was safer for them to do so. And then we see the Snake River Massacre, which happens in Eastern Oregon, where 7 white men robbed and brutally murdered 34 Chinese miners. It's literally one of the bloodiest hate crimes in all of Oregon's history, and most people are not aware that this even happened, and it's something that is definitely not only symbolic, but really shaped the history. I mean, it's really one of these horribly violent events that tells us where Oregon has been, and some of Oregon still is. 3 people were brought to trial. None were ever convicted. There was a man that was interviewed about it in the 1980s, I believe. He was an older gentleman. He'd gone to the trial when he was a child, and he said, you know, if it was white men that had been murdered, I'm certain something would have been done about it, but because they were Chinese, nobody seemed to care. That's really a tenor of the times. Oregon was also once home to the largest Klan membership per capita in the United States. Between 1921 and 1922, there were 65 active Klaverns throughout the state of Oregon. Also, when we think about important public policy that was shaped during that time, it was most certainly shaped by the presence of the Klan infiltrating all forms of government, public services, everywhere. So between 1921 and 22, 14,000 members were recruited in Oregon. The Klan also used necktie parties to instill fear over racial and religious groups. So while the Klan numbers dropped over the years, Oregon's white supremacy still remained, still does today. In 1988, Mulugeta Sarah, who was an Ethiopian student, was murdered randomly by 3 white supremacists in Portland. It sparked protests and also advocacy across the city. And then the Max Line murder that happened in 2017, when a man murdered 2 men and injured a third as he was confronted for shouting racist and anti-Muslim slurs at 2 Black teenagers on a Max Light rail train in Portland, Oregon. So interesting to watch the news articles about that, because they referred to these young teenagers. They referred to these teenagers as young women. White women in that age range, they do not refer to as women, they refer to as girls. So we see that even though, you know, these people were victims, we're still seeing their age sort of elevated in a way to where we're not actually having to be as cognizant of the effects of something like that on them. So these laws and practices and hate and harassment throughout Oregon's history have created longstanding barriers and have had a disparate impact on Indigenous, Black, Chinese, Japanese, Latinx, and other people, especially when it comes to home ownership and the accrual of wealth generation. In 1936, the FHA published the underwriting manual, which incorporated segregated principles and biases to guide appraisers in loan risk analysis, and it established restrictive homebuyer policies. Composition of neighborhoods would be enforced by, first, restrictive covenants, which prevented an owner of real estate to sell or transfer property to Black people or other racial and religious groups that were not part of the dominant religion or race. This was declared legally unenforceable. These deed restrictions were considered legally unenforceable in 1948 in a Supreme Court case, Shyle versus Kramer. Thurgood Marshall, who of course went on to be our first Black US Supreme Court judge, was an attorney on this case. And so while this case did say that those deed restrictions were legally unenforceable, it was very hard to find somebody to enforce the fact that these were legally unenforceable. However, what this case does do is it starts to chip away at segregation within neighborhoods. Also, racial covenants. These were agreements that were made between local real estate agents that ensured non-white populations were kept restricted to specific neighborhoods through redlining. Banks during loan risk analysis would color code zones based on the racial composition of the neighborhood. We're going to talk more about that in a little bit. There was also the Realtor Code of Ethics at the time, which said if a realtor were to sell a home to a Black person or a Black family in an all-white neighborhood, they would also lose their real estate license. So we're seeing this discrimination institutionalized at many different levels. So we see over time how wealth, education quality, and opportunities available in communities are directly related to the racist policies that initially determine who can live where. Lower socioeconomic neighborhoods means less tax revenue for schools, which impacts education as employment opportunity and also wealth accrual. Groups of people not being able to purchase a home inhibits generational wealth growth. Also, general health and well-being are impacted. Unhealthy environments increase stress and anxiety. There's less accessibility or more inaccessibility to services and healthy foods from both a lack of proximity and also a lack of wealth. Oregon's historical legacy and current forms of displacement, exclusion, and segregation continue to create barriers and impact the lives of Oregonians. Speaking of gentrification as displacement, this means historical members of a community are priced out of neighborhoods, and they are usually then renters and not homeowners due to policies that have been put into place. We also see segregated housing patterns and steering, which of course still exists today. Portland nationally has the 5th highest disparity in arrests by law enforcement. Criminal records are barriers to renting and also are barriers to homeownership. There was a study done in Multnomah County, for example, in 2016, where they actually took a group of 100 people that were white, 100 people that were Latino, Latinx, and also 100 people that were Black, and they were all arrested for the same type of crimes. And what they were trying to determine is, what's the conviction rate look like in this county? And what they found is that the conviction rate, same type of crime, right? So if our criminal justice system is equal, we should see a same percentage across the board of people being arrested. And what we see, I'm sure is not surprising to this group, 6 times more likely to be convicted when a person is Black, 2 to 3 times more likely to be convicted if a person is Latino, Latinx. White counterpart, of course, more likely to be let off with no charge. This has significant impacts in a person's access to housing. Acts of hate and harassment focused towards protected classes have been on the rise also since November of 2016. I'll let you draw the line between what was happening in November of 2016. At the Fair Housing Council of Oregon, we've also seen a rise in the disproportionate number of fair housing cases related to disability and with intersections related to other protected identities. This is important to note because low income and unhoused people are disproportionately members of protected classes. The current number of unhoused people in Oregon is directly tied to the inequitable and unjust history of our housing system and our inability to provide equitable housing for unrepresented and oppressed communities. In many rural communities, and likely in urban ones as well, many might think that the unhoused people in their town are from somewhere else, but studies show that the vast majority have been long-term, if not lifetime residents of the places where they now find themselves without a home. Women, families, people living with disabilities, people in the LGBTQIA+ community, and others have also suffered from same kinds of impacts and barriers to housing, even if in some cases that appeared in different ways. All this to say, Oregon has a historic legacy when it comes to housing displacement, segregation, and discrimination. And it is important to know our history so that we can strive to not repeat it. Next, we're going to go over some significant discriminatory practices, historical and present. So we're going to talk about redlining. So redlining is the discriminatory practice of blocking whole areas from having access to mortgage loans and other services in order to segregate populations and deny wealth accumulation opportunities. So if we're going to talk about redlining, we also then need to talk about the creation of the FHA, the Federal Housing Administration. So the FHA was created as part of an innovative process during the Depression to change access to home ownership and wealth creation. So before the FHA was created, people had to put 50% down on their home and then had 5 to 10 years to pay off the balance. That would make home ownership pretty out of reach for most folks. With the FHA, we see a loan structure that is actually still in place today. People put down then 20% on their home and can pay off the balance of the home with a 30-year fixed rate mortgage. However, with this innovation, the federal underwriting standards incorporated de facto racist standards. And what I mean by that is that who was decided to loan money to was specifically related to a person's national origin and their skin color. This list comes from the American Institute of Real Estate Appraisers, ranking the most to least favorable people to bring value into a neighborhood. So this is literally the United States government assigning value to where a person is from in this world and their skin color. So loans were given out to people who were ranked higher on this list and not on who was ranked lower on this list, which is really important because we think about people being forced to be clustered into specific neighborhoods. One thing I think is interesting also to note is Northern Italians and Southern Italians rank very differently on this list. Northern Italians are second, Southern Italians are 8th. They come from the same part of the world, but what is different? Northern Italians are blonde and blue-eyed, and Southern Italians are darker complected. And I do want to note that Indigenous peoples didn't even make this list. Why I bring this up is that the redlining of neighborhoods that were predominantly communities of color led to extreme racial inequities in how those FHA loans were distributed. So between 1934 and 1962, of the $120 billion, let me say that again, $120 billion in loans made by the FHA, less than 2% went to non-whites. Also, a side note on this, the GI Bill was passed to help support our GIs who were ending their service with our country, to help support them. And so there was conversation in Congress about how are they going to distribute those GI bills? Well, there was a conservative Congressman Rankin from the South who said, why don't we distribute the GI Bill in the same way that we do those FHA loans? Because he knew the systems that were in place and he knew that it would perpetuate segregation. And the government agreed. And so less than 2% of GI home loan bills also went to GIs of color. So let's talk also about the practice of steering. Steering is the discriminatory practice of directing prospective home buyers away from a house or area that they are interested in or towards one that they have not expressed interest in when that home buyer is a member of a protected class or based on that person's protected identity. So an example of this might be, oh, you want to rent this apartment? Well, we don't have a lot of kids that live here. We don't have a play structure. There's a busy street. You might be happier at that place across town, right? Steering people away. It might be somebody being told our neighborhood doesn't have many families like yours, to a queer couple. And we know that this steering still exists today. Let's talk about home ownership rates. The gap in home ownership has been perpetuated by racist systems woven into all aspects of American society throughout its history. These systems produce unjust and inequitable practices in education, employment, access to social services, as well as access to housing. All these factors actively contribute to the struggle for people of color to accumulate wealth in this country. Data from a February 2022 CNN business report states, Black home ownership remains at 43.4%, which is lower than when the 2008 recession hit. Black home ownership is 30 percentage points behind white home ownership. So I want to give you some examples of home buyer discrimination, what this might look like. And some of these actually come from the focus groups that we held. You're told that you don't qualify for a conventional mortgage when you know you do. You're screened out from receiving homeowner insurance information via phone until you can prove that you are legal. We heard this in our Spanish-speaking focus group. There are many different ways to prove identity beyond a birth certificate. A mortgage lender or real estate agent asks you about your religion. A buyer should really only be asking questions relevant to the application, right? Any questions about identity that could be used for discriminatory purposes are problematic under the Fair Housing Act. More examples of discrimination. You're told that you cannot use your disability payments to qualify for a loan because you can't prove that you will continue to receive that income. So questions should only be about current applicability. A lender asks you to fill out extra paperwork and or repeatedly fill out paperwork that has already been submitted, which then delays the process. We heard about this happening often with non-English speakers. A homeowners association denies a person's application because they don't allow wheelchair ramps in their homes. To be very clear, people living with disabilities have the right to ask for reasonable modifications or reasonable accommodations based on disability to restore equal access or equal enjoyment to housing. Also, another example, an HOA might typically say that homes are not allowed to have fences, but let's say that a family requests the fence because their child living with autism needs to be able to play safely within the yard. So the HOA should allow the construction of a fence with the caveat that it be removed when the family moves or sells the home. I want to give you some real life steering cases as well. So in 1979, the US Supreme Court concluded in a 7-2 decision that 2 real estate agencies had intentionally steered Black home buyers towards an integrated neighborhood while steering white home buyers to predominantly white neighborhoods. And then in 2019, Newsday published findings on steering by realtors in Long Island, New York. They found that overall agents provided white testers an average of 50% more listings than they gave to Black counterparts. So this idea that discrimination no longer happens is completely false. I was doing one of these fair housing trainings for realtors in Southern Oregon, and this was probably about, I would guess about 8 months ago. And I had said, you know, what types of discrimination are you hearing about, you know, for your buyers in selling? Like, what are you hearing about in Southern Oregon? And of course, one guy sort of raises his hand, this white guy, like, there's no housing discrimination happening. I'm not seeing it. I'm not hearing it. And then another realtor, a woman, raises her hand and she says, oh yeah, I'm selling a condo in an HOA community. And the HOA president said, I don't want you to sell this condo to any family that has a kid or anybody that has an assistance animal. So right there, discriminating against families with children and also people living with disabilities. So we know that this discrimination is still absolutely alive and well. So I want to give you some hypothetical examples also of some other types of red flags. It could be withholding information. So a same-sex couple expresses interest in homes with certain features like a backyard pool, and the real estate agent withholds that information. It could also be inconsistent information. So a real estate agent warns a white prospective homebuyer against the local school due to low test scores and funding, but tells a Latinx prospective buyer that it would be a great school for their kids. So I was doing a training probably about 3 months ago for a group of realtors, and one of the realtors said, how do I respond when they ask me how the schools are? How do I respond? Because we know that test scores are specifically related to, you know, racism, discrimination, all of that. One of the realtors basically raised her hand and she said, here's how I answer that question. I have a child that's neurodivergent. A school that would be good for my child is very different than a school that might be, you know, good for a child that's not neurodivergent. So I turn around and I ask them, what do you mean by a good school? Getting very clear and asking those pointed questions rather than just accepting the status quo. Let's talk about linguistic bias. So it's really important to understand how language accessibility can have a disparate impact on certain communities. There are over 60 million Latinx people living in the United States, but too often realtors don't have Spanish-speaking agents or Spanish language materials. Linguistic bias can also happen when someone is denied services due to having an accent that indicates that they may have been born outside of the United States. So denying access or creating barriers for specific groups against home ownership in these ways is problematic under fair housing law. Also, more examples of appraisal discrimination. Over a 40-year span, houses in predominantly Black neighborhoods devalued by roughly $48,000 per home, when homes that were very similar in white neighborhoods appreciated by $200,000. I'm going to give you a story now about appraisal discrimination that happened in 2021. If you're interested in reading up about this story on your own, you can just look up appraisal discrimination Duffy. That's the woman's last name, Duffy. And I'm just giving you a case. There are many cases about discrimination in the appraisal process that have been coming out recently. So in 2021, there was a case that involved a Black woman living in Indiana who wanted her house appraised for refinancing. She had bought her house for $100,000 4 years earlier. The first appraiser came back with a value of only $125,000. While the homeowner knew from an independent market analysis that the property was probably closer to about $187,000. So she hired a second appraiser. This time the value came back at only $110,000. And this was really the red flag where she's like, there's something going on here. There's something wrong. So what she did, she hired a third appraiser. She left her race and her gender off the appraisal paperwork. She asked a white colleague to stand in for her, a white male colleague to stand in for her when the appraiser came to the house. With that third appraiser, the house was valued at $259,000, which is more than twice the original appraisal. So this is an example of how racial discrimination affects home ownership and access to wealth accrual over time. And that is not an isolated case, to be very clear. There's one that I just heard about, I think it was like a week ago or 2 weeks ago, that came out where it was a house that was appraised for about $200,000 less than what it was valued at. And when the couple basically had a white counterpart stand in for them, the second appraisal came back at the value it should be at. And people can figure out what their home is worth because they can look at comps in their neighborhood. And that's exactly what they're doing to figure out what this looks like. So with that, so by 2022, the incidence of discriminatory appraisals had become so prevalent that the Department of Housing and Urban Development created an interagency task force known as the Property Appraisal and Value Equity Task Force, PAVE, to address the concerns. And you can find them online. And this is, of course, created under Marcia Fudge. And if you don't know who she is, you should look her up. She's doing some pretty great work. Okay, so let's talk about lenders, redlining, and lasting effects. So this becomes a cycle that feeds unto itself. So redlining, the denial of mortgages, leads to disinvestment of communities of color for generations, which leads to lack of home ownership, which leads to lack of wealth accumulation, which leads to continued opportunity segregation of wealth, income, housing, schooling, health, all of these different life areas. So moving on to some lender discrimination. In 2021, there were complaints of a bank in Indiana redlining African-American communities, which led to major policy changes and repairs. So in this case, a bank in Indiana agreed to expand their mortgage lending services to majority Black neighborhoods in Indianapolis after complaints were filed that they were redlining certain communities. They also agreed to start a $1.1 million loan subsidy fund in majority Black neighborhoods, as well as to hire a community outreach specialist and 2 mortgage loan officers specifically for those areas. And then in 2022, a major bank was found to reject half of its Black applicants that were filing for refinance. So in 2022, this study found that a major bank and lender had rejected half of its Black applicants in refinancing their homes. The rejections came after qualified applicants had paid steep application fees. The second bullet point specifically is an example of what is called predatory inclusion. So with predatory inclusion, while outright exclusion, such as redlining, has been the primary practice of realtors, banks, and lending in the history of housing discrimination, once new credit laws and the Fair Housing Act were passed, a new, more insidious practice called predatory inclusion took hold. And this is a quote from a book called Race for Profit: How Banks and the Real Estate Industry Undermined Black Home Ownership. And the quote is, predatory inclusion describes how African-American homebuyers were granted access to conventional real estate practices and mortgage financing, but on more expensive and comparatively unequal terms. So predatory inclusion was largely responsible for the subprime mortgage crisis of 2008. So subprime lending is basically the lending of money to people who, due largely to the conditions of the loan, are unable to maintain their repayment schedules. Thus, they fall into foreclosure with their homes or experience other extremely harmful financial effects. By March of 2008, approximately 8.8 million borrowers had negative equity in their homes. Okay, we're going to talk about HOAs. So basically, when the Supreme Court voted that deed restrictions were no longer legally enforceable, HOAs were created to help to maintain that discrimination, that segregation within neighborhoods. So HOAs were really born from these racial covenants for, in quotes, the good of the community. So from the book, A Republic of Equals, here's a quote. Anti-Black racism motivated some of the strategies used by homeowners associations, such as deed restrictions and covenants that explicitly discriminated against Black people by compelling other owners to avoid selling to them. HOAs perpetuate racial and economic segregation by blocking fair participation in housing markets, thus denying wealth-generating opportunities and upward mobility for many Black people and lower-income families. While the Federal Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968 prohibiting racial discrimination in the sale and rental of homes, HOAs still find ways to exclude or discriminate against Black home ownership. A recent report found that neighborhoods with HOAs are less racially diverse and less regulated, and less regulated cities have higher HOA premiums, leading researchers to believe that residents rely on HOAs to facilitate segregation. Something interesting also about those racial covenants, those restrictive covenants that are listed in deeds of homes, if you actually research population makeup of those neighborhoods, of those towns that had been governed by those restrictive covenants, they are still usually a majority white today. So we still see the effects of that thing from years ago, definitely having an impact today. So while in 1948, the Supreme Court ruling made racial covenants no longer enforceable and the Fair Housing Act outlawed them 20 years later, homeowners associations are still often caught discriminating. When I started to work at the Fair Housing Council of Oregon 6 years ago, there was a case that was being settled at that time. It was an HOA in Salem who had basically said that a family with a daughter living with a disability, she needed an RV for medical transport because part of her disability had to do with incontinence issues. So she needed an RV to be transported to these appointments. But the HOA had a very clear guideline that said people could not park RVs in their driveway or in front of their house. But this is not an RV for like, hey, we're just going to go on vacation. This is literally being used as medical transport. And the HOA was not willing to budge. In that case, when I came on board at the Fair Housing Council of Oregon, was being settled for about $300,000. And that money is being paid by the HOA specifically. There's another case that I wanted to talk about. In 2009 in Arizona, the Maricopa County Superior Court awarded $200,000 to a couple. The husband is African-American and the wife is Latina, after they heard an HOA neighbor say that, in quotes, Black people shouldn't be living here. And that was during a remodeling dispute. In 2013, the US Department of Justice ruled and reached a settlement with Townhomes of Kings Lake, Inc., an HOA, and Vanguard Management Group in Florida, the two groups agreed to pay $150,000 to settle a lawsuit alleging that both groups enforced occupancy limits that discriminated against families with children. Also, in Las Vegas, Nevada, the Ardent Homeowners Association had to pay $350,000 in compensatory damages and $385,000 in punitive damages after it was found that the HOA was discriminating against an HOA member who had become disabled. The homeowner now required a service dog, and the HOA continuously denied her and her dog access to the community clubhouse, saying they did not allow pets. So those are different forms of discrimination that we are still hearing about happening today in home ownership. I also wanted to share some of the information that I got out of the Realtor Focus Group as well, because I think it's really important. One of the things that they said is this question, what can you tell me about the buyer? It's not appropriate, because anything that is shared about the identity of that buyer that then gets used to determine if they're going to sell the home or not to that person, that's problematic under fair housing. So when realtors ask in training, so what do I say to that? Literally say, the Fair Housing Act says, I'm not allowed to share personal identifying information about these home buyers, because that can be used to discriminate, but I can tell you more about their offer. Also, guessing ethnicity and race from names is problematic as well. So efforts to determine a protected class of a buyer in order to deny them housing must be avoided. Realtors also face discrimination. So discrimination may also be directed at the realtor. So some realtors of color have intentionally left their headshots off of promotional materials or asked white colleagues to show homes. The safety issues of buyers of color in certain neighborhoods also affect realtors of color as well. Realtors of color also may fear reprisals if they report, like fear of losing clients. Realtors in general may also fear reprisals for advocating for fair housing. One of the realtors who had participated in this focus group, a realtor of color, had said, I called somebody out for discriminatory practices and they wrote a negative review about me online. Now, anybody that wants to use my services sees that review. Others may simply also not know how to report, and others don't want to report a colleague. But of course, the problem with that is if things don't change, things don't change. If actions, if actions aren't taken, then status quo is kept. So it's important for realtors in this also to stay invested. So recommendations coming from realtors: stay rooted in the positivity of the work that you do. Also call on allies for help. Another one said, get the word out on fair housing and be willing to be very public about it. Also, it's important for realtors to pursue and update training. Now, this is really interesting because when somebody gets a real estate license, there is a very small section on fair housing in their initial licensure process. Realtors are also required to get continuing education units, every year to keep their license current, but none of those are ever required to be fair housing related. So, addressing discrimination amongst realtors. So it's important for realtors also to increase their knowledge and awareness, engage in annual trainings, also include training to protect the safety of realtors of color. Also, it's important to acknowledge the personal impact, but also the professional and societal need for reporting. So let's talk about how fair housing laws actually get enforced. So most commonly, our organization gets contacted first. We get over 2,000 contacts a year. We resolve the majority of fair housing issues that we hear about through advocacy. We also, at our organization, speak English, Spanish for language needs. Outside of that, we do use the language bank. There are also no income requirements to use our services. There are also no documentation requirements to use our services either. If our advocacy efforts don't work, we can also help to file a claim with HUD or the Oregon Civil Rights Division, BOLI. So BOLI hears about state protected class violations, whereas HUD hears about federally protected class violations. Next comes the investigation. So figuring out, did the discrimination actually occur? Using investigation tools. So investigation tools might be, logs of conversations that have been happening. any written records to and from, any pictures, any recordings that might be helpful in these sorts of situations as well. In rental housing, we can also sometimes use testers to figure out, is there discrimination happening at the application process? So that's basically using secret shoppers to figure out, what is the housing provider telling the white prospective applicant versus telling the applicant of color, or the applicant with the disability, or the applicant that supposedly has the Section 8 voucher, right? We're also looking at, is it a dwelling, and does that qualify as a dwelling under fair housing law? Enforcers of these laws could include BOLI, HUD, the State Attorney General's Office, the U.S. Department of Justice, or an attorney like a civil rights attorney or a legal aid attorney. And outcomes really vary based on the case. So is it that we're actually just educating and advocating? That outcome is going to be really different to improve housing access for that person. Or is this one of those cases like that HOA case in Salem that settled for $300,000? So outcomes are really going to vary based on the nature of the case. If you would like to help us uncover housing discrimination, we are always looking for more secret shoppers. So if you're interested, you can call us. Also, you could email just information@FHCO. And we have copies of these PowerPoints so that information is in there for you. And if you would like to contact us for more information, you can certainly do that. We would be happy to hear from you as well. And then lastly, to learn how we're doing and to document the usefulness of our work, we ask that you complete a brief evaluation. This evaluation literally takes less than 2 minutes. If you just do the front side, it's less than a minute. It asks 6 questions. It asks you to circle 1 to 7. You circle 1 if you're like, I hated this presentation. 7 is like, this is the best presentation I went to all conference. Yes, the best. Okay. But also this, this tells HUD the type of work that we're doing, and if this is actually helpful to be sharing this type of information, if that's impactful. With that, we are done with the presentation, and we certainly have a bit more time for questions if you would like to ask them. And if you want to sneak out early, please just go ahead and fill out that evaluation. Gina's going to camp out at the door and collect evaluations from folks as you leave. Because I know if you don't want to fill out that evaluation, that you might just be like, I'm not going to make eye contact with Gina as I walk out the door. And so please just fill out the eval. All right, question.
Yeah, thanks so much. That was really great. I'm not doing many sales right now, but I do still have my broker's license as a realtor. And we could go on and on many different angles on that. One angle that I'm interested in is something that you started to get at in some of your examples, which is trying to actually manage the public's expectations of the realtor to participate in discrimination, and massive education need, basically, in short. And I know that the hurdle of just trying to get the professional industries trained and educated is a huge one. I'm also wondering if FHCO or other groups are starting to, or maybe you do and I just don't know about it, think about campaigns and educational materials geared just at the general public. Yeah.
So I'm so glad that you said that. Okay. So a few things that we're doing. We have built up relationships with Oregon realtors. And so we've been doing, regular education sessions with them to get more realtors to come and to learn more about fair housing. So that's one thing that we've been doing. We also have been creating, materials for home buyers. So that's one of the pieces of material that Gina handed out, the 1-pager. And for realtors, that's actually really handy to just stick in that initial folder, because I've bought several houses. I know that you get the informational folder from realtors. And so that is really, really handy to include in there. We're also in process of creating a guide right now that is fair housing for home buyers. And so it's a whole guidebook that talks about that. Once we have it created in English, we're also going to translate that into Spanish and possibly other languages as well. I know that 1-pager, we also had requested to translate that in Russian. And so we're working on that right now as well. Oh yeah. And if you haven't filled out the sign-in sheet, please do that, because that tells my boss I was where I was supposed to be today. And he's like, okay, Shyle's doing a good job.
Just to clarify, the work for, and I don't know because I'm not looking at what you're working on, but the work for developing materials so that the general public knows their rights, for example, or what different types of discrimination looks like if it's being perpetrated against them, like super important. Also language like reasons why you can't ask your realtor this question, basically, or like when the public is actually requesting that professionals essentially engage with them in their own discriminatory practices. And so that's the education that, it can come from us in those really hard conversations. And also if there were a third party that we could say, hey, here's this wonderful thing you can just go watch or look at or read about why I can't, we can't have that conversation.
I love that. Will you do me a favor? Will you write that down on the evaluation? Because we have a grant requirement that if there's commentary about things like that, then we update our training materials to reflect it. And I think that is a really important piece to bring in to say also home buyers can't be asking specific questions that also have discriminatory lenses to them.
And sellers. Oof.
Yeah. And sellers especially. Yeah. Thank you. That's awesome.
So you gave a great example about that realtor that was on that where he protected discrimination and then he got that bad review. Are there rights for realtors that if should they be put in that compromised situation that can they go to fair housing to get protected too? So we're wanting to make a change.
Right. So it's interesting because so that realtor you're talking about the woman that was the realtor that had the negative review put online for her. So unfortunately, because she's doing the work as a realtor, it falls under employment law. It doesn't fall under the Fair Housing Act, which is really more around protecting the rights of the consumers of housing, and then also setting standards for how the housing providers are supposed to act. Realtors are actually falling in that housing provider category more than in the consumer category. Yeah.
I just want to share that at some point we might put the camera on, so you might not want to have your whole thing projected on the screen. I don't know if there's sensitive information there or something.
No.
I've worked in computer security.
No, trust me, there's nothing that exciting up there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I second Shyle's, call to action about joining joining as a tester. If, no one's going to know it better than, people who are involved in the work. One quick note though, that was actually my phone extension and I am not the testing coordinator, Shyle. Do you
get a lot of calls about testing?
No.
That's been in our decks for a while.
I don't. This is the
Okay.
first I'm hearing about it. Our testing coordinator's extension is 105. So
Okay.
otherwise the same number, 503-223-8197. But Joyce's extension is 105, not 104.
Thank you, Sam.
If I get a call from one of you, we can have a conversation and I would be happy to direct you to where you need to go. But just letting you know, 105.
Gina, will you look at the Zoom screen real quick just to tell me how many people are logged in? I'm super curious. Fabulous. All right, folks. Well, if there's no more questions, I will hang out later. We do have some other materials that are, left over. So if you would like more to take back with you, please feel free to grab those. Do fill out that eval and give it to Gina at the back of the room before you leave. And thanks so much for being here and have a good rest of your Thursday. Thanks.